Payroll preferences allow users to determine the way that certain features behave within CenterPoint. Before you set up your payroll or do your first pay run, you'll probably want to review those preferences, and we can do that underneath File and Preferences. That's going to come up on another monitor on my computer, and I'm just going to drag it over to one that you can see here. Down the left-hand side are different groupings for preferences, and the ones that we're going to talk about in this video are the ones in the section for payroll, so I'm going to click on that. As I highlight a preference, and I'm going to highlight the one for printing checks, as I highlight a preference on the right-hand side, there are several tabs. The tabs that we're going to really talk about are, first off, the Current Settings tab, which just tells you how the preferences are set at this moment. You can set the preference on either the Application tab or the Database tab. The Application tab would be setting it for all databases that are available for you to open, and the Database tab would be setting it for the database that is specifically open. So it would use one or the other. So it'll use the Application preference as long as there is not a database preference set that is different. Okay, in some instances, such as this one, we will force you to set the preference on one tab or another. So in this case, we are forcing you to set this preference on the Database tab. So for printing payroll checks in CenterPoint, we have to tell the system what printer we want those to go to. So that drop-down should provide you with a list of printers available to your computer. Then you're going to select the check type. So what style of forms did you order from the forms vendor? And you can select that what you've ordered. Then you will determine the kind of detail that you want on the pay stub by selecting a stub type. Okay, the standard stub includes things like your earnings, your taxes that were taken out, your deductions. It includes current and year-to-date information, and will also include leave balances. Okay, there are, though, it isn't going to show you any benefits. So therefore, we do have other styles that will show you different details on them. Any of these styles can be viewed by going to the Help button on the bottom right-hand corner of this Preferences screen, so you would be able to see a sample of each one of those styles. The standard styles allow for 10 or for 8 detail lines, such as if you had 8 different earnings, there would be enough lines for like 8 different earnings or 8 different deductions for an employee. If it goes beyond that, it's going to print to an overflow stub. So if you find your system going to an overflow stub pretty frequently, then you might want to choose the option for 15 detail lines. It'll be in a smaller font, but it will include more information. Okay, I'm going to choose the one with leave and benefits. Now, if you have pre-printed checks, you likely don't want to print either the check number or the name and an address on the check. However, if you have blank stack checks, you might want to say yes to both of those options. It gives you an option on how you want to handle Social Security numbers on the pay stub. Do you want to print the Social Security number, just the last 4 digits, or not at all? If you're an agricultural employer and you have H-2A workers, you need to print onto their stub not only the number of hours that they worked, but the number of hours that they were offered. So you would say yes here in that scenario. Otherwise, everybody else will choose no. When you enter in a pay run, you are allowed to put in a memo for that pay run. And if you want that memo to print on each of your employees' paychecks, you can say yes here. Otherwise, you can say no. The number of copies that you want of the checks to print would be usually 1. The only time that you would want more than 1 is when you order duplicate style checks. Do you want a bilingual check stub to be your default check stub? If so, then you would say yes and choose the bilingual check stub from a list of stubs to the right over here. But you first have to set up that bilingual check stub under the setup of pay stub translations. I'm going to choose no, which is going to give me an English style stub. Some printers have a hard time handling large volumes of checks being sent to them for printing all at one time. So this option at the bottom will allow you to break the number of checks sent to the printer queue down into smaller increments. Okay, now I'm going to go to the printing advices option, which is only something that you have if you have our direct deposit module. So if you are printing out advices, you could go ahead and a lot of these options are very similar to the checks, so you can choose the check or the printer that you want those to go to. On the advice type, usually people are going to use plain paper for these payroll advices, so you'll usually choose the one that is check with one long detail stub. Otherwise, why do you want to print the stub information twice? Then you're going to choose, once again, the stub type. So what kinds of details are you seeing on this stub? You'll likely match whatever you've selected on the payroll checks. Since you are usually using plain paper for payroll advices, you would probably want to print the advice number and the company name on it. So those are generally usually set to yes here. Again, whether or not you want to print the Social Security number on the pay stub should usually match what you've set on the payroll check option as well. If you are an H-2A employer and you have H-2A workers, you'll probably want to set the print hours offered to yes. Otherwise, you'll leave that at no. The number of copies you want of each of the payroll advices, and then do you want to print direct deposit amounts? So direct deposit amounts, if you said no to this, it would still print the total amount that it's going to direct deposit for that employee, but it would not show you how much was going to each account if they had it split among multiple accounts. If you say yes here, then it will show you on the pay stub or show the employee on their pay stub how that direct deposit was split up between different accounts. And then once again, if your printer has a hard time handling large volumes of advices being sent to it at one time, you can break that down into smaller batches of pay advices. Okay, I could hit save after both of these and it would save that, but it also just does an automatic save. So I'm going to continue going to the different payroll preferences and we'll hit save at the end. So I'm going to now go up to the very top. This first preference, it has to do with employers that are paying employees biweekly. Normally, we determine that there are 26 pay periods in a year. So we take that person's annual salary, we divide it by 26 pay periods, and for salary employees, that's then what we would pay them. So we take their annual salary divided by 26. Well, in some years, you might have 27 pay periods, which means they get a slightly smaller check, but they get one more check during that year. So in that year, you need to tell us the year and then the number of pay periods there are. Otherwise, we're going to go ahead and continue to pay them as if there were 26 pay periods in the year. The General tab allows you to set the decimal places that you want to use for different pieces of information. So the number of hours that you enter in for an employee, how many decimal places do you want for that? For the rate of pay, how many decimal places do you need for the rate of pay? If you have piece rate workers, do you need any decimal places for those piece rates or the pieces that they've worked? Like, for example, if they are getting paid per bushel they pick, are they getting paid for a half a bushel? If so, then you would need at least 1 decimal place. And then it uses up to 5 decimal places for tax percentages. Below that is, how do you want this posted to the general ledger? Do you want a detail for each check showing the gross amount and then all of the deductions and what the net check is? Or do you want to print, or do you want to post them in summary? Okay, so you can make that determination there. When entering in your pay run, you can attach management details to the earnings and then they get posted to the expense associated with that earning. So if you are taking and allocating your wage expenses to different profit centers, locations, projects, tracking number 1 and tracking number 2, for those of you who are agriculture, that's going to be your production year and production series. So if you are tracking that information or entering it in with all of your earnings, the system can do a validation when you go to post your payroll that would require you to have it on all earnings. Otherwise, it's going to stop you from posting the pay run and give you an error. It can warn you, which will allow you to continue on, but it'll tell you that some of that detail is missing, or you can say that it's not required at all. And that is the same for all of these different details. So whatever detail it is that you want to make sure that they do a validation on. Now, even though we might be entering in, maybe I'm doing a validation on the profit center, but I might have some earnings that are being split to multiple profit centers using an account distribution. So technically, it doesn't have a profit center on it at the time of posting the payroll. Instead, it has an account distribution. Okay, so do we want it to skip earnings that have an account distribution? So don't give us a warning if it has an account distribution on it. Okay, the next option on the left-hand side is a preference for leave. And you get the option to tell the system whether or not you want the date of the adjustment for leave to be the pay date on a pay run. So if you're adjusting leave on the pay run, do you want the date that it uses to be the pay date, or do you want it to be the last work date? So the from and to dates of your pay run, so the to date. Okay, so you get to make that choice. And then we also have some validations or warnings for when you're entering in leave on a pay run. So if you're entering in the number of hours that a person took for vacation, the system can do a validation to make sure that they have that many hours available. And it can provide you with a warning. So do you want it to give you a warning when they've exceeded the number of hours that they have during hours entry, when switching to the next employee, or when leaving pay entry? And you can actually select more than one. So I'm doing it at 2 different places to make sure that they have that number of hours of leave available. Pay dates is the next validation. Do you want the system to use default pay dates? What that means is once you do a pay run, the next time you go to do the next pay run, it will try and determine your work dates and your pay dates based off of the prior pay run. If you don't want the system to default the pay dates in, then you would say yes here. If not, if you do want it to default them in, you're going to say yes. Okay, this option for pay defaults is used with our advanced earnings matrix. So we're going to skip that. That's used with that additional module. And we're going to come down here to the salary hours option. When recording pay for salary employees, some people all need to also record the number of hours that those salary employees worked. And we can make the system, force the system to default those number of hours in by saying yes here. And then for whatever your pay frequency is, you tell us what the default number of hours is. For example, if I paid weekly and my employees only worked 35 hours a week, I would put 35 here. Okay, so you want to make sure that you first put in the correct number for your pay frequency, and then you can then set up the system to default those hours in so that you don't have to manually enter them in. The only time you have to touch them is when they're different from that. The next option is for timesheets. When entering in time on timesheets, and you have the choice of entering in time by using their start time and their stop time. And you want that time to be in military or AM, PM. Okay, so you get the option of how you want that time formatted. If you are using calculated overtime in CenterPoint, or you are not paying overtime at all, you might want to hide the simple overtime calculation. Okay, if you are paying overtime, but you're not using our calculated overtime feature, then you probably do not want to hide the simple overtime calculation. Okay, and last on the list is a section for warnings. We're going to give you a preference for whether or not you want certain warnings to come up. And this one can only be set on the application tab. Do you want a warning when no tax state has been configured for an employee? You're likely going to say yes to that because if you don't have a tax state configured for that employee, you likely forgot something in the setup. So it might be that you haven't selected that state yet. Okay, when no SUDA state has been configured for an employee, basically the same thing. If that state has SUDA and you want to go ahead and calculate SUDA for that employee, then you're also going to say yes to having the system provide you with a warning that you haven't entered it in yet. And then do you want a warning when no workers' compensation class has been configured for an employee? You might say yes to this if you don't want CenterPoint to calculate workers' compensation and provide you with any kind of workers' compensation reporting. If you are using CenterPoint to calculate workers' compensation and provide you with workers' compensation reporting, then you probably will say no to this. Now at the end, if I click save, it will save all of those settings. Even though they've already been saved, it'll save those settings and it will close the screen.